You're calling from a 518 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Hello, this is Jakob calling in from Germany, if that's me.
Jacob, it
Can
is
you hear
you.
me?
Yes, sir. Jacob, how are
Yeah.
you? Thanks for
Ah,
calling.
wonderful. Um, I don't know, how are you time-wise?
Good. Go ahead.
Okay. So it's quite a basic point, but I wanted to get your opinion on it. Um, what do you think of the limits of social democracy and like welfare states reform if they are not like backed by organized workers? Because
I
um,
think I.
our yeah,
Oh, sorry. Do you have more to add to that?
uh, of course. I just wanted to engage in a dialogue, and the audio lag is a bit confusing for me always.
Oh, right. I understand. Um, I'll try to be mindful of that. Well, I mean, I think to the extent that there's a debate about this stuff that comes up on this show, or if you're trying to, I mean, the nuance and the perspective, I think, are kind of three things. One, you know, I'm not an accelerationist, and I don't believe in pushing human misery to its outermost limits in order to instigate change. So that means that on a very just, you know, I agree with Sam in terms of voting as like being a tool and a practical thing. So I believe, you vote to minimize suffering, and you vote to create conditions that are the least materially harmful possible in a given context. And that is going to mean, and has meant, voting for a lot of terrible, mediocre, and so on, so-called center-left candidates. That's almost always the case. The second point, more broadly, I totally agree. I don't think you can have. I think that the challenge of the left right now, in some ways, it's harder in the United States because there hasn't been the same. The Democratic Party is not even traditionally a historically left party. It's a very weird and unwieldy coalition of many things. But you cannot have a sustained left, even social democratic one, without serious labor power and without ancillary and connected institutions, movements, and groupings that place a context around the politics. And obviously, I mean, you see this, conversely. I mean, if we were to take Syriza at face value and their best intentions, and I think plenty of people in Syriza were, they simply could not do it, because of the powers outside of their control. So there's no doubt about that. And then the third thing is, what does the mechanics of that inside-outside strategy actually look like? And I think that's where it gets, it does get complicated. And I think people need to, really strike that balance. I think pure electoralism is not going to achieve what we need to achieve. And I also think downgrading and minimizing the importance of literally holding state power is just delusional. So it's somewhere in those three. But I mean, your general point I agree with, but as always, sorry?
Should plug the Botanga thing too.
Oh yeah, I want to say I just actually literally did an illicit history that's going to be released Sunday for TMBS patrons with Mark Potanga, who's a member of the Belgian Workers' Party and an advisor at the European Left, European Parliament. And we talked precisely about this. What would it take, specifically in this case in the Eurozone, to have an authentic left govern? And we talked about everything from, in that case, there are new political configurations which can work in Europe because of the parliamentary system and so on. But, but also the fact that, there were dock strikes going from Finland to Spain. But, again, he didn't. He took the momentum of the strikes and also what just happened right with Ryanair as incredibly important. It still doesn't, it's still like you still need to take control of European institutions, and a major part of that is electoral. So it's really about just how do we actually synchronize these things, and and I think also act appropriately in the different venues. I love the strikes, and strikes should be radical and I think pretty uncompromising and very militant. electoral politics demands a different set of skills and strategies, and they're complementary.
Right. I would say, as far as this, we're totally in agreement. The thing is, a tendency, if you focus on electoral politics, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me? Oh.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yep, just go ahead. You're
Okay.
totally clear. Go ahead.
Okay, wonderful. If you only focus on electoral politics, and that's a phenomenon that I saw again and again, basically then you think, okay, the work is done. We've got our guys in.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the case. That's when the work begins.
Yes,
The
definitely.
most interesting case of threading that needle, basically, in my opinion, were the Austrian Marxists, Red Vienna and stuff like that, because they were engaged in 3 fronts. They were scientifically very well educated, statecraft-wise. They had a lot of lawyers and stuff. They're also organic intellectuals of the working class, and they managed to use being in power to build up the institutions for the working class outside of the state as pressure points, and they had a really good strategy to combine those. So,
and when the right does
every,
that, we're just going to say, like, the right does that when they help corporations out, right?
Well, yeah, that's actually the really funny part, is that in a way, the obvious difference is the difference between, just unlimited money and resources and a game that's designed to benefit the corporate sector. But in some ways, you can look at inside outside. Yeah, the right has a great model of it. They fund intellectuals and propaganda and PR infrastructures. They have all sorts of transnational and global forums to organize and coordinate themselves. That's actually it. I mean, there you go. Those are the analogous models of globally connected nodes and networks, and we see flashes of it. I mean, I remember there was a story. It just wasn't where we were at. This is the other thing too, is where you're at in specific historical moments and what is and isn't achievable. So like the incredible achievements of Lula are very specific to a period of time when, under Bush first, my God, and then even, and then under Obama, it was really still firmly a global neoliberal consensus. So he found a way to still get 20 million people out of poverty. That's a major achievement. On a more organic and local level, there was I think in 2007 or 2008 when Mugabe was seriously cracking down on Morgan Tsvangirai and the opposition, and there was mass violence after a disputed election in Zimbabwe and a lot of serious state security violence. There was a group of workers in South Africa that refused to unload and dock a shipment of weapons, I believe coming from China, to Zimbabwe. And that's amazing. That is the work. And the question is but in the geopolitical context at that time, that was morally inspiring and very important, and it didn't mean anything because it could easily be circumvented. So we need to figure out, again, what could get it to mean something is if you had, as an example, a South African, government that took its history seriously and block those arms shipments from Zimbabwe, as an example. So I think you're 100% right. It just, as many of these things, it's just, it's in the how. And I love that Austria example. I'm going to look into that. That sounds like that also would make a great TMBS illicit history.
Right, and you would have counter examples against the Sam Harris type of intellectual, like atheists who are very logically minded, but also Marxists, and also that's what really bothers me about those kind of people. I always used to consider myself an atheist, but in the Marxian sense, like opiate for the masses and all that stuff, like criticizing superstition and deifying oppression and stuff like that. That was where my atheism came from, and that always was spirituality is something completely different and divorced from organized religion, which is a tool of oppression. That's the classic atheism.
Yeah.
And when this new atheism came around, it was what the fuck? These people are even more stupid than the people 400 years ago. Read some fucking predecessors of Marx, and you would have better grade atheism. This atheism is it's like religion. It's completely stupid, and I was baffled. I was a proud atheist like 10 years ago, and now I'm like, well, yeah, I don't believe in that bullshit, but I also don't believe in the other bullshit. So
you and I are very like-minded,
You
my
know,
friends. You distilled so many of my thoughts there.
I went through a similar progression myself, and I kind of appreciate it now because if I'm talking with a religious person about atheism, I can say like, yeah, I don't technically believe in God, but I think like the way these atheists online present themselves, and then we can sort of bond over how like
obnoxious
awful those people are.
Right. Yep. And I think it's also interesting that if you look at older atheist writing, Marxian or otherwise, it's interesting because it's so much more historically grounded, literary minded, and it also deals with the consequences of, there's another thing that triggers people because they don't understand the point. It's not that obviously accepting science, whatever that even means, but okay, I'll make it concrete. Accepting evolution over creationism is obviously a major step forward in terms of your understanding and grasp of the world. But on the other
May I
hand,
interject?
but substituting, in a second, but substituting belief in God for some idea of progress in science is foolhardy. And then that's another thing too that I think initial atheists, they were dealing with. Well, these myths need to be unsettled and disrupted, and they just replicate, cosmically the oppression that exists in our real lives. And that's already a different frame too, because they're actually connecting it with understanding and uprooting oppression. But then they're actually saying like, well, what is the substitute? What's the alternative? Not just a kind of blind positivist, well, we'll have, flying cars and that will do the trick. I mean, they were really dealing with actual stuff here. And that's another distinction.
You've already anticipated my interjection. That was like, even with evolution, there was like Kropotkin, mutual aid, that competition is not the only leading principle within the development of nature, that the evolutionary theory is just a projection of liberal principles into nature, not entirely backed by facts, and is highly ideological. There's no such thing as a neutral science. And stuff like that. If you look at the debates about social Darwinism at the beginning of the last century, for example, and people today are so, or you look at Frankfurt School theory about positivism. People today are so stupid about this that they consider themselves advocates of science, and they have no philosophical, epistemological backgrounds, no consciousness of how problematic this concept of the knowledge TM is and stuff like that, and it's really,
it's all just lack of. I mean, the big thing that always just comes through is just no historical awareness, whether it be literal history or intellectual history. I mean, and I'm talking on some of these things are as simple as like, I remember taking philosophy of religion in college, and you had to read, you read positivists, you read Freud, you read Nietzsche, and so then it was just very easy to realize when some character like Sam Harris came along. I mean, even if you agreed with him, to just realize, oh, okay, this is just a restating of something that was said in the 18th century, and it's obvious where those blind spots are. I mean, it's just amazing, just the utter lack of I think that I think historical illiteracy and the idea, and this is a weird way that quote unquote science interacts with this stuff, because it actually supports for these people a stance of ahistory. It's almost like I don't need to know anything because I know, I'll get pop neuroscience, I'll get pop evolutionary biology, and then everything else is just hot takes on culture as it is now. And I can skip everything else. I don't need to know intellectual history. I don't need to know policy history. I don't need to know, anything.
Yeah, Sam Harris thinks removing history from a discussion is controlling the variables.
Right. Exactly. And not like the variable. What were you gonna say, Brendan?
Just going to say that scientism in general in that way is extremely dangerous.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right. A joke a friend of mine would tell about those kind of people was always, if they were in a concentration camp, they would say, well, actually, if you structure the camp this way and you enlarge the doors that way, you would be able to kill more people per hour. And the only thing that they would criticize about the concentration camp would be it's not efficient enough.
That's no, there's no, well, yeah, and are people like, oh, you're not, yes, like, well, actually,
yeah, well,
I
actually, people can only count corpses,
right?
And not appreciate life.
That's precisely it. I appreciate the call as always. I really appreciate your insight. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry for just agreeing with you. Might be a bit boring, but okay.
No, it's better.
That's it.
No, it's better that way.